So, one of your big themes is that today's political climate has become incredibly toxic.
Well, I think in politics in particular, but you see it really in a lot of spheres, but in particular with politics, you see a lot of this in-group, out-group dynamic. It's basic idea of psychology where you have you have your groups that you assign yourself to, and then you have the other groups that you don't assign yourself to, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but becomes exacerbated to the point where outgroups are treated as an existential threat simply for existing, which is, you know, kind of I don't know if ironic's the right word, but they also see a lot of them see you the same way, but we don't really take that logical step. We usually just see them as completely other, even subhuman to an extent. And everything the outgroup does is bad. Everything my group does is good. You might within the in group, you might have some internal strife. Sometimes Democrats get upset with Democrats, Republicans get upset with Republicans. But as soon as somebody else outside the group has something critical to say, then all of a sudden you all band together, and it's very tribal response. And then you also have this fragmentation of media. Back in the 60s, you just had three channels or three TV channels, and everybody went to the same place to get their news. Over 40, 50, 60 years, you've had an explosion of media outlets, and now it's not just TV and radio. Now you've got it on the internet, and you can easily find an echo chamber to tell you what you want to hear, and the media algorithms also prey on this. There's just obnoxious headlines and coverage like so and so owned this person. It's like, but did they really? It just really preys on the political biases that people have, and then, of course, everything is just about winning at all costs. It's about destroying the other side. It's not about. There's not a. We don't really sit back and think about how things are being done. It's just the ends justify the means kind of thing. So a lot of those are three of the really big issues I see with toxicity in politics today.
Was it always like this? It feels like the internet brought something out where, as you were saying, you could find an echo chamber that fit your kind of unique niche, and you could, sit in there and have that bubble around you. But was it always like this? Were people always this toxic and the internet kind of just allowed us to see this at scale? Or did something else happen recently where we're just seeing this explosion of people saying whatever they want about anything in any way and treating it as like both valid truth and also fake?
It's not. I wouldn't say it's new. I think it's just the intensity of it all. But like you said, with the internet now, there's always been those kinds of people, but now it's right in your face, and those are the people who get highlighted. So it often makes it look like it's more common than it actually is, that vocal minority kind of thing. So some of it is just the fact that it's getting amplified now, not so much that it wasn't there, but that it's amplified. And but I do think though there is a little bit of an intensity where it is getting worse, just because when you highlight these people that say whatever they want to say, a lot of people who have a different political view kind of they have a retaliatory, well, I'm just gonna say whatever I wanna say, and it just kind of becomes this vicious cycle. So, yeah, I would say that it's not new, but at the same time, it does seem to have an renewed or a new intensity to it, but it's just more so that those people get amplified a lot more than, you know, back when you didn't have instantaneous, communication.
Sure. And, we're right on the topic of people purposefully amplifying it, purposefully making these insane arguments and, trying to stir up hatred and toxicity on social platforms or just create public unrest. Are there ways people unintentionally add to the toxicity, or like people, the way that they interact with politics now kind of fuels the fire rather than trying to diminish it?
Think for everybody, and this includes myself, we can't treat it as these are other people that are doing it and I'm not contributing it to, or I'm not contributing to the issue at all, because in a way that's a lot of people who are being toxic think that same way. One of the ways that a lot of people don't realize is when you highlight polarization, which is a major contributor to this toxicity we see, there needs to be a careful balance in highlighting it. Yes, we need to show that it's a problem, but there are also studies that have suggested that when you emphasize polarization, you can actually add to that polarization, kind of back to that whole, well, I have to retaliate to against the polarizing figures on the other side, and so we're going to be polarizing too. And it particularly what we call affective polarization, which is your dislike of the other side. That particularly gets heightened. So we do need to highlight the negative impact, toxicity, and polarization, but we can't harp on it too much. Although there was a study actually just a couple months ago, back in July of 2024, that found you could help reduce polarization by adding what the authors of the study called a polarizing content warning, and it tells people basically that hey, some scientific findings have found that news content about polarization can actually increase it, and that does help a lot with mitigating the would-be polarization you would get from highlighting these issues. And in a similar vein, we also place too much focus on the negative versus the positive, which is another part of our DNA. Negative info sticks out in our mind much more than positive info does. They're actually drawn to conflict, and polarization and toxicity are emblematic of that. Those are the things that get amplified. We we say we want uh, camaraderie and we want uh, compromise, but we a lot of times don't go looking for that stuff. Conflict is what drives the clicks, drives the views, drives the listens. And there's also a tendency for kind of going back to what I was talking about at the beginning. Some people approach the issue of toxicity with this holier and thou attitude for wanting to bridge political divides and be above the political fray, where they go, hey, look at me. I want to bring everybody together. I'm not the one contributing to this kind of thing, and that kind of turns people off. It's a bit of a pretentious attitude, and even if they are not actually above these political games, they can contribute to the divide themselves. So we need to. I think every one of us can look at how we're approaching things and think about, okay, I need to make sure that I'm not contributing to this toxicity myself. We need to be much more willing to hear other people out. And yes, that needs to be a little bit of back and forth where they need to hear us out too. But we just need to be careful that we're not looking at ways or that we're not doing something where it's like, oh, actually, maybe I'm also contributing to the toxicity. You might not be uh, rabidly partisan or ideological, but just that again, that attitude of being holier than thou because you want to bridge the political divide. You just got to be careful that you're not pushing people away, turning them off. You need to hear other people out in order for them to at least give you a little bit of time to say something as well.
I mean, I hate saying this, but it is easier said than done to be that cognizant. And it feels like more and more people are becoming less cognizant and less willing to hear other people out as we become, again, more polarized. People start talking about the extremes as the base arguments. So, as an initial question, how did you become cognizant of this type of thinking, of this effect of the echo chambers? Was it just you kind of realized one day and then you started being more mindful of it, or was there something else that happened?
Everybody has a bias, right? A lot of people don't really recognize whenever they're being biased, or they think it's everybody else that's the problem and not them. So it just kind of over time. I don't know if there was a specific point where I was like, okay, I need to take a step back too, but it's just sort of a gradual thing of okay, maybe I'm also contributing to this issue because everybody, hopefully, people change over many years. Some people don't. But you ideally want to look back on ways you've approached whatever issue it is, things you might have said to somebody, or if you're talking about politics, how you've approached political debates or arguments in the past, and think about, oh well, maybe there's a better way to make that argument, even if it's something that you don't necessarily believe anymore. But a lot of it was coming to the realization that I didn't enjoy Back in high school, I knew political science, politics in general was something I wanted to get into, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And it wasn't until I took a class with uh, Dr. Susan McManus. She's a local and national local analyst and commentator, and she's the single biggest influence on my career. Uh, just the way that she approached politics with a as impartial a lens as possible was just like, wow, I really like approaching it this way. And I'd seen her on TV before, but then actually having her as for a couple of classes and just having that direct influence from her, I realized, you know, all sorts of ways that I can approach political science and political commentary better. And also, uh, later on, when I went to Ballotpedia, I started working for Ballotpedia, the nonpartisan encyclopedia of American politics. They're very uh, rigorous about their bias training because that is the big thing for them is there's all sorts of there's obvious biases that you can saying oh, the Republican Party is right or the Democratic Party is right or independents are right, but there's also a lot more subtle ways that bias can affect your thinking, and just a lot of those ways that I was taught, it helped hone my skills about being as impartial as I could be, while still recognizing some of my own biases. Whenever I talk about anything, I look back at what exactly I'm saying and say, okay, can this be considered? Would somebody reasonably say that this has a bias to it, or that this is faulty in some way? So it's just been kind of a gradual. To bring it back to your question, it's just been kind of a gradual realization of these skills, having uh, the training and bias and just repetition of the craft. It's just a it's a constant thing, right? Having to acknowledge biases, try to weed them out as much as possible, and try to correct them, and be open to constructive criticisms from people in case they see something that could be considered partial or biased.
I don't want to stray too far away, but I would like to go on the tangent of what were some of the subtleties of noticing biases that you figured out that you learned? Because it would be kind of nice to have that framework for the viewers and to take that and put that in the toolkit of, okay, I'm having this conversation about politics or whatever it is. How do I notice that I'm being biased in that moment and maybe reframe myself?
Especially when you're covering a debate, you never approach it in a way where you think something has one side to it. Something might it might seem like a very obvious, like, well, of course you would. Why wouldn't somebody support this side of anything? And it might seem like, oh, there's an overwhelming support for something, but it doesn't mean that there's somebody else that thinks a different way. For example, in my podcast that I just started, my first episode was talking about age limits on government officials and the debate about whether people think we should and shouldn't have them. And it's something that it seems like a lot of people support, and somebody might think, how could somebody be against having those maximum age limits? I should specify. Should they be? If they hit 75, they have to retire, or 80, they have to retire. And you see that with some. There are some of those laws for state level judges, but you don't have them for Congress and uh, and for president. There's a minimum age limit in a lot of cases, but there's not a maximum age limit. And it might seem like it's a very straightforward, well, yeah, we need to have at some point, but there are people that don't agree with that. And there are people, and again, I'm not saying that I do or don't agree with it, but you have to think, okay, what are some of the possible ways that somebody could actually have a differing argument and not a caricature of somebody's argument. Actually think try to put yourself in their shoes. So if I go back to that example, somebody who supports having a maximum age limit might say, well, there's a cognitive decline in people that's natural as they get older. And then somebody else on the other side could say, well, that's not always the case, and people that are younger could have cognitive decline too. So you can keep going back and forth on these issues, and you just really have to make a considered effort to think about those things. But if you're just talking about news in general, one type of bias is called coat rack bias that Ballotpedia has devised or had devised. And just to be clear, I don't work for Ballotpedia anymore, so I don't speak for them, but I still believe in their mission, and I take a lot of what I learned from them and carry it on in my own work. But we have one that's called coat rack bias, which is basically you find one aspect of a story that doesn't really have a whole lot to do with that story, and you kind of go off on that tangent. Like if I'm saying, I don't want to pick anybody in particular, but X candidate for office, uh, uh, you know, they put out this new policy proposal, and then you go on to this issue of, well, also they had a DUI. Doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the story at hand, and you're already trying to paint them in a way where don't listen to whatever policy proposal. It might have nothing to do with alcohol or driving. It might just be something healthcare related, for example. But it's not that you can't necessarily say, "Hey, they had a DUI," but it doesn't have anything to do with that story at hand. So that one can be a little bit more subtle. Sometimes it's a little bit more obvious. Sometimes it's a little bit more subtle, and it's just those kinds of things that you have to look out for.
Yeah, no, that's a great explanation. Thank you for that. It's I think you just did it, which was I don't support this side or that side, right? And when you're being nonpartisan and you're not trying to conform to any side, you constantly have to say that when you bring up these, core issues of like gun rights or abortion or whatever it is. It's like, no, 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 I'm just talking about it. I don't support one side or the other. And then people try to be Procrustean and cram you into one box. As soon as you say, like, you're pro-choice, for example, you're automatically a Democrat and you associate with everything of that side. Or if you say, I'm for gun rights, you automatically are associated with everything that Republicans are associated with, whatever is going on. So, it is very difficult to be nonpartisan, but I think that there are some benefits of it. But how do you approach being like non-ideological and nonpartisan in your daily life, and how does that affect your work?
You have to think about going back a little bit to the last couple of questions. You got to think about what you're saying from multiple partisan and ideological views, and also you don't ever say it, the whole. There's an idea from a lot of people that it's a little obnoxious when people say the truth is always somewhere in the middle. No, no, maybe not necessarily, but that's that is still a form of bias. You're saying that both sides are wrong about something. They're both right about these particular things. It's not so much about that. You give credence to people from various parts of the political spectrum, but you don't ever say somebody's right or wrong about something. I mean, there's very few instances where I feel like I should be saying that, and it has to be for something particularly strong for me to say something. But again, I would say this is my opinion. So I limit my opinion as much as possible. Whenever I do have one, I try to make that as clear as possible, but I don't ever single out people, party, ideology. If I use examples of something, I try to use both sides. And then to go back to your example with abortion is you always got to acknowledge really every policy debate, unless you get to like a very fine, like if you're talking about a very specific law where it is really just a dichotomous yes or no kind of thing. But if you're talking about a wide ranging policy debate like abortion, for example, or LGBTQ plus policies, you don't you have to look at it from you have to look at it as it's a lot more in depth than people make it out to be when it comes to LGBTQ. It's not just about whether same sex couples should be able to marry. It's about whether they should be provided, whether you can healthcare, for example. Those are two different aspects, and somebody might support one of those things, but not support another. Or with abortion, you might say, uh, should if it's the life of the mother versus if the mother's life's not in danger, but she uh, does not have the financial means to take care of the kid, or if it's a matter of incest, or if the mother's life is not in danger, but she could have still have significant health complications in the future. Again, obviously, I'm not saying I agree or disagree with any of those things, but there's a tendency for, especially for people who have a vested interest in keeping things very divisive, is you kind of just have this whole blanket statement about these policies. Like you said, oh, I'm pro choice. Oh, I'm pro life. Okay, you might be in a specific circumstance, but what about circumstance B, circumstance C? There's a tendency to uh, overly simplify things in politics, partly because it's easier to engage people that way. But it's very rare that a political issue can ever be boiled down to either yes or no. Which one do you support?
And see, Paul, the problem is it always is. And we go back to talking about pro-life and pro-choice, and it's like I say I'm pro-life or pro-choice, and or someone says they're pro-life or pro-choice, and I'm a very like inquisitive person. I'm a very curious person. I like having conversations. I like having difficult conversations. I like just asking why, like a 3-year-old, why this, why that. And it's like I've caught myself in numerous situations where I ask why just out of curiosity, and people treat that question as an attack, as immediately hostile. And it's like, I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm not trying to say that what you're saying is bad or good or whatever. I'm just trying to explore your mind. And it seems like, as you're talking about, there are a lot of gray areas. There are a lot of, like subtopics about each topic that you want to explore, that you want to like disentangle and make clear. But if you don't have the necessary critical thinking skills, like you've just kind of like downloaded someone else's argument and you're just regurgitating it and you think that it's yours, you can't really talk to anybody about this. And it seems like, not to overgeneralize, but it seems like most people suffer from this, whether it's from the internet or whatever. Like, what are the other challenges of being nonpartisan but talking about politics, especially in your work? Because it seems like you have to navigate so many different, you have to navigate a dynamic landscape, you have to navigate, the biases, the social media interpretations, all of that. So, like, what does your day-to-day look like when you're doing this?
A lot of times it's an inherently emotional thing, and it happens to all of us. At some point, we're very convinced of something that we believe, and sometimes we don't react to questions about it the way we should. But for some people, like what you're talking about, it's a very chronic. Anytime, if you don't agree 100%, it's considered personal attack. Even if you are genuinely inquisitive, a lot of people think that their worldview has, completely uh, explains everything. When if we talk about the abortion debate, people who are pro-life and people who are pro-choice can have equally valid experiences that make sense as to, okay, this is why they believe in uh, the side that they support. And for some people, it's you can't even be inquisitive. You just have to accept their viewpoint because they've had a lot of people tell them that you know that their viewpoint is correct and that anybody who disagrees with them is stupid or evil or whatever the case may be. And you just have to go in knowing that there are some people that are just going to be like that. Some people though that are like that, they generally have the capacity to critically think about things though, and you got to be able to give them critical thinking skills. Like if we talk about a new study that says, conservatives are more likely to I don't to I can't really think of a specific uh example, but conservatives are more likely to think X and liberals are more likely to think Y or whatever. You look at this, you don't just tell people hey, this is what's wrong with the study. You go to, or here's what's right or wrong with the study. You say, okay, well, you have to think about who wrote the study, who was it funded by. Give them all sorts of little ways of like, okay, they how did they approach the question? All these little things. So it's not just saying, giving credence to both sides or saying here's what's right or wrong about how they approach things. You also got to give people the base skills to approach things. Like, I think there's a very serious issue in this country with the teaching of civics and critical thinking skills. It's in a very sad state. I don't think we sufficiently teach it, if we even teach those things at all. And so in a way you kind of have to try to give people those, excuse me, you have to give people those tools to be able to do those things, like the very basics about civics. You don't say, somebody's right or wrong about, you know, whatever this is. Like if we're talking about mail-in voting, and that's had a little bit of a debate about the security of mail-in voting. Well, you don't talk about, well, it actually is secure or it's not secure. You tell people some of the basics about, well, how do each of these states handle when voting or vote by mail comes in, for example, and you try to walk people through critical thinking skills about that. Like, okay, is there a possibility of this not being secure, or why is this method secure, for example? And so going back to uh, the overall question, you're thinking about how exactly, or you want to give people the very base tools to be able to approach things themselves, not just tell them. Again, we're having an issue with people being told what to think, but you're trying to teach people not only, hey, this is how things are. You're trying to give them the tools to be able to figure those things out for themselves in the long run.
Yeah, I have two independent flows of thought that might converge. It does seem like what you're talking about is utterly impossible in the current state of social media, where you're talking about being very rigorous and thinking and talking about the topics and going through it, trying to dissect exactly what we're saying, what do the words mean, and then coming to a conclusion, where that doesn't really exist on something like TikTok, where you have 60 seconds, which is the limit. I mean, 10 minutes, but 60 seconds. And then, the best videos are 7 to 15 seconds. So you kind of have to make your point. And yes, it has to be pithy and sticky. And also, a TikTok comment is like, you're not going to take those seriously in terms of what the argument actually is. So that's flow number one. Flow number two is that I remember in high school, my history teacher would always talk about how her dislike of Trump, right? And I always thought that was so inappropriate, not because I'm for or against Trump, but because why are you telling us your political opinion? Because then you're going to sway us instead of us having a preference or a dislike for him. It's like I want kids to be able to think about, as we're saying, we want to teach kids how to think about politics, right? We want them to think for themselves rather than like them downloading whatever beliefs and preferences of the worldly generations. So I guess the more difficult question I want to ask you, and I'm putting you on the spot, is like, how, in your perfect world, how would you teach kids about politics? Would it be in the classroom? Would it be maybe using the internet? Would it be a combination of both? Would you want there to be a lots of collaboration on it? Like how should we even go about this?
Right. And a lot of young people have this conception of politics being boring or is not worth their time or whatever, and they just have, somebody tell them what to think. For for kids, yeah, you absolutely need some level of school curriculum, and some states have tried to uh, uh, implement those kinds of civics programs again, make them more part of their curriculum. But obviously, not everybody's in school. A lot of people are done with school, so you need other sorts of programs for them. Even having so much as like a local forum. That that's something I try to do too. Is have local forums try to teach people about civics, or even this would be a longer term kind of thing, but even like almost like a certification. of sorts, like how like in coding, how people have C, C++, Python. I mean, that stuff's way above my head, but I know that those kinds of things have those kinds of certifications. You can even have something sort of like that. Uh, but the big thing is you need to at least provide that outlet for those people to find that, and not just provide it, but you have to be able to make it easily accessible enough that people can don't have to really go digging too much to say, oh, hey, there's that kind of thing. But there also has to be a bit of they have to want to get involved in civics or critical thinking programs in that way. So you really have to really show them benefits of that kind of thing. And it kind of goes back to, saying toxicity is bad. Okay, well, that sounds very obvious and straightforward, but you got to kind of lay out the reasons why toxicity, lack of civics, lack of critical thinking, why that is such an issue. Because for some people, they don't necessarily care. You have to make them care. But at the same time, there are still a lot of people that do care about that. They do really want to have a nonpartisan look at politics. A lot of times they just don't know where to find it or they don't know that it exists. And I'm not act like I'm the only person that's trying to do that. I'm not. I mean, that'd be very conceited. But I try to give some people a unique way to be able to find that kind of stuff. And also, you know, don't make it so dry. A lot of people, even if they are very nonpartisan about things, politics in general can just be very dry and unengaging. So you have to you have to make it engaging for people to actually want to be able to learn about it. So, I mean, I know that's kind of a uh, overarching, not a very straightforward answer to the question, but it is a little bit more of a complicated answer. But in short, you really need to give people both school programs or make it part of their curriculum. But for the people who are out of school, you need to give them uh, programs that they can be in too, such as like a certification or a free class, that sort of thing.
You know, we always appreciate people being self-aware, but it's also like we can't give straightforward answers to stuff that's just not straightforward anymore. Again, it's not a black and white phenomenon. It's a very gray thing. Um, Politics is dry and unengaging, and that does make it difficult to make it fun because, you try to, again, going back to my example of talking about like abortion or something and just saying why or being curious. To me, that's fun, whether it's abortion or whether it's like space mining. I like talking about it. It's just interesting to me. Whether you're talking about, whether we should be mining asteroids in the Kuiper Belt or whether we should be, is there consciousness after 8 weeks? Is the fetus conscious, right? Then we talk about what is consciousness? Is there sentience? Blah blah blah. I love Lex Friedman because he's always talking about how to make a topic beautiful, and it seems like you're doing that. So how do you go about like bridging the knowledge gap in politics, making it beautiful, making it unique in your own way? Obviously you're not the only person doing this, but you're doing it in your own way. So how does that work?
In regards to the fun and engaging part, I also try as much as I can to be as self-aware as possible. Self-awareness is something that is very important to me, and I like to think that I'm pretty self-aware, but I don't know. I mean, I can always improve on that regard, but also just don't take myself too seriously. Yeah, there are certain topics that you need to give an appropriate gravitas, but can't constantly treat everything as an existential crisis. Like if we're talking about the election this year, I mean, every election, people treat it as an existential crisis. Like democracy is at stake. Our very what it means to be an American is at stake, and I mean that a lot of that is a scare tactic by really every candidate that is running. But I don't ever treat it like that. I just say Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are running, and this is what they believe, or this is their chances of winning X state, or why do these states tend to vote Republican, or why do they tend to vote Democratic? I don't, those kinds of things you don't need to make an existential threat or make it seem like, oh, are very way of life is at stake. And also, I try not to assume things. I try as little as possible to assume something is common knowledge. Because a lot of people, it's not even so much that politics is unengaging, they just don't feel like they can understand it. They have what we call a low internal political efficacy. Internal meaning referring to how much you understand politics and how much you think you understand politics. And an external refers to how much you feel like you can actually impact politics. And a lot of people just have a very low political efficacy and they don't know where they begin. Or we sometimes treat something as, well, like you should know how this works kind of thing. Like those of us who are more involved in it or pay attention a lot more to it, we, for example, we know how the electoral college generally works, how electoral college is what actually decides presidential elections, not the popular vote. A lot of people don't necessarily realize that, even if they have participated in voting before. So I try never to treat something that as common knowledge, but at the same time, you can't talk down to people either. Oh, explain what voting is. You don't have to do that, but you try to you treat everybody as you don't treat anybody as stupid, but you don't want to act like they should know something that they might not necessarily know. Um, but I also try to find as many things as possible that aren't often discussed, and then try to shed light on them, cover them holistically. I'll go back to my own podcast where I have an episode about election timing. That's something that a lot of people don't know about. Where basically, why do we have elections typically, at least for president? Why do we have them every 4 years in even in November? But then there's a lot of other elections that happen every 2 years, and then there's some that happen in odd numbered years, and there's some where they're decided in April or May or June. So I try to cover those, say this is why you should care about these things, and don't bog it down too much, but try to give people as well-rounded a, coverage of it as possible, and explain how it works and why it works the way it does, and give people the tools again to be able to analyze it much more themselves. We go back to another debate and about the in this case election timing where, well, what would people argue about we call them off-cycle elections, where basically they happen at a regular time. It's their normal schedule, but they're normally happening in like May, for example. And I'm not necessarily primaries, but general elections. So say, okay, people argue, for example, a lot of people like off-cycle elections because, and you usually see it for local elections. The local elections are less nationalized, but then somebody on the other side will say, well, it also really limits uh, political participation because these off-cycle elections see a lot less voters participating. So kind of goes back again, try to cover things as holistically as possible, but don't bog it down too much with a bunch of minutia. It's a fine line that you got to walk, and it's something I'm trying to get better at every day. But you got to, in short, don't assume something is common knowledge, but also don't treat people as dumb. But try to take things that are either often discussed but don't aren't really covered very well, or things that aren't often discussed and shed light on them as much as possible.
You recently wrote a book. What was the book about, and why did you write it?
So the book I wrote is called "Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Could Become More Competitive." So it's an overarching view of obstacles that independent candidates face for office, how those obstacles work in tandem, and actionable ways that independents can mitigate those obstacles. Now, it's not an argument that we should have more independent candidates or that we shouldn't have more of them. It's just about the overall situation, and why these independents find themselves in the situation that they're often in. And several of the reasons why it really interested me was, A, I don't think independent candidates are really understood very well, and it's kind of it's one of the many paradoxes of political thought. People say they want independence or they want a major third party to become competitive, but when it comes time to vote, they often usually vote for, as a lot of people would call it, lesser of two evils. So it's kind of an in-depth look at, well, why do they do this kind of thing? It's a an area of politics, again, I don't think it's understood very well, and it's something I had to learn a lot more about as I researched it, trying to give as well-rounded a look as possible for people to understand uh, the issues that these independents face, why they don't actually compete that much. I mean, you see them win every once in a while, but it's very few and far between, and it's usually at a local level. So just trying to shed light on that and explain something that people aren't as privy to.
I've always thought that, I'm just riffing right now, but I've always thought that politics, like the way we go about voting and thinking about politics, is very antiquated. Like, I need to vote for, one person that has a variety of ways of thinking and a variety of policies that they want to enact or take away. And that just seems very strange. Like when you go to a restaurant, you don't just pick like one option that comes with everything else. Like you can pick a la carte, or if you go to a buffet, you can pick exactly what you want. And I always thought that with this influx of technology, of preferences, being able to connect with people around the world, around the country, you could just talk about exactly what you as an individual prefer, like what your political stances on a variety of topics are. Maybe you are pro-choice, but you actually want gun rights, right? Maybe you are the other way around, but there's no way to vote for that specific combination. And I always thought that instead of choosing the candidate that best associates with what you value, the candidates could look at precisely what you value and then start enacting those policies, which makes them, the drivers of their party, etc. Is there room for innovation in politics, or is this kind of just like this is the way it is? Or is that kind of the point of the book where it's like, yeah, independence can be that innovation. They could solve some of these problems.
I mean, they could be, but again, I try not to argue that we should have more independence. Now, I do believe that there is a very serious issue with political competitiveness. There's way too many elections for federal, state, and local levels where the candidate, a certain general election candidate, if they're a Republican or if they're a Democrat, they're going to win the election. There's some places where no matter what happens, Democrat's going to win. Some places, no matter what happens, the Republican's going to win. Not necessarily saying that those are bad candidates or that those places shouldn't be voting that way, but there needs to be more options. And I think there are certain ways that there are a lot of different ways that you can approach politics and try to innovate. Do we change the primary system? Do we change how debates happen, or just all sorts of little things there. Another thing you touched on was like being able to have these candidates implement what things that you want, but they're not necessarily in agreement with. But a lot of there's a lot of different groups of people that are tugging at them, and sometimes with disparate views on policies. So it's you can't really necessarily appease them all. But there are other ways that you can try to implement those policies. Like for example, a lot of people in November will have state constitutional amendments to vote on. Like for example, down here in Florida, there's one related to abortion. There's one that is would make school board elections partisan as opposed to nonpartisan. Vast majority of states have nonpartisan school board elections, but there are a few that have partisan ones. In Florida, up until I think 1998, had partisan school board elections. So that's another way for people to directly impact policy without necessarily voting for a specific candidate. So there's always ways that you can make it better. It's just sometimes it's very hard to actually try to implement those kinds of things. But you have to give there has to be ways to give candidates incentives to or people who are in office incentives to act on those kinds of things. If you don't have political competitiveness, they're going to be much less likely to listen to certain groups of people. They'll just listen to the people that automatically you know that support everything that that candidate stands for, and they're just going to worry about those groups. If you don't have that political competitiveness, there's going to be less and less room for other people to try to make their voice heard. So I think we have to have a lot of changes in that regard, but there are always ways to try to innovate. It's just about being able to get enough people to get behind that kind of thing. And obviously, I mean, that's a lot easier said than done. And we can talk the whole day long about how to do those kinds of things, things that I have not even considered, kind of thing. Uh, but in short, though, there are plenty of ways that can innovate. It's just obviously it's easier said than done trying to implement those changes.
Sure. One of the last questions, but Gen Z are like the massive disruptors of businesses. Like they're forcing businesses to conform to them. You know, they also bring about different views on diversity, for example, whereas for for example, the baby boomers look at diversity as like different races or different ethnic backgrounds, whereas Gen Z look at it as different different life experiences, different ideas, different opinions. They are just the disruptors of most things. They have fresher ideas, whether it's because of technology or whether technology is corrupting them. Gen Z are going to make their way into the political landscape, for good, bad, ugly. What advice do you have for them to think rigorously, to think about politics in a beautiful way, and also maybe to restore politics to what it should have been, what it should be, and also what it could be?
Well, you go, talk. You just mentioned diversity. You always got to know that there are always going to be people that have a different lived experience than you, and are going to have a different viewpoint. Doesn't mean you can't work together. Doesn't mean you can't come up with something that works for everybody. But this is we're all Americans here, and just we all have to we have to get along, and there's nothing wrong with that. And there's also nothing necessarily wrong with impassioned debate, but it's when we start treating it as an existential crisis that we have to start fighting everybody over. I think that's when we need to all take a step back. And talking about school programs where civics and and critical thinking. Obviously, that's particularly important for Gen Z now because they're the ones that are coming up, and we need to be able to give them tools and for them to realize, hey, there's always a way where we can always approach politics better than the way it's being done now. And just like with any other generation, give them the tools to be able to approach that and to come up with their own interpretations of things, but also realize that other people can come up with valid interpretations of things too. You don't have to agree with it. You don't. And sometimes you can even vehemently disagree with it, But always have to remember that this we're all ultimately on the same team at the end of the day, and we have to be able to make this political culture and climate better than what it is right now because if it keeps this is just not sustainable to be able to have this much strife, and it's going to get to a point where it's just you can't overcome it, and in the end, nobody's going to win. Yeah, some people might get short-term success, and they might have some short-term wins on policy and everything, but in the end, in the long term, we're all going to lose if we have this such strife and enmity. People mental health is going to decline. The civic health of this nation is going to decline. So we do need to remember at the end of the day that we're all on the same team here and we all have valid viewpoints that at least need to be heard. You don't necessarily need to agree with them. Again, you don't necessarily need to agree with them, but do have to be able to work together.
Paul, this was a very informative, very unbiased conversation about politics. One of the very few unbiased conversations I've ever had about, the meta issues. Where can we find your book? Where can we find you online? What's your podcast called as well?
So the podcast is called Politics with Paul, and you can find that on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. I'll be starting a newsletter very soon, and I'll have details more for you to share for people later. Uh, the book again, it's called "Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Could Become More Competitive." That is primarily there's several websites you can get it on, but primarily you can get it on Amazon. It's ebook and paperback format. And obviously, please leave a review for that. It helps me out a lot. And like, comment, and subscribe on the podcast. Uh, I have Facebook page, Paul Rader, author and speaker. You can also find me on LinkedIn and trying to think of if there's and my website, paulrader.org. So Rader is how you spell the last name. And then I also write about various political science topics on Medium, which is, and if for people who don't know, medium.com is just basically a place where you can have a blog and you can just find users there and read what they have to say. So I write on various political science topics there as well.
Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you.